Now, your textbook doesn't go into Art Nouveau furniture, but I do want to get into it because you will occasionally come across pieces that are Art Nouveau, and I want you to be able to identify them should you come across them or if you're asked to design in that style. Now, in terms of chairs, what you will see are takes on forms that we've seen before. I mean, these look very, very French, very basic. These are very simple forms of chair, but we see that decorative element added to them. Now, in this case, we have a mix of some of that Art Nouveau use of line, curvilinear form, but then the very naturalistic butterfly on the back, or these pieces where you see the whole chair is made up of leaves. More commonly, you would see something simple like this, maybe a press back, with, in this case, this is leather, but maybe a press back with an Art Nouveau motif on the back using those whiplash lines. Here you get the sense through the construction that we're dealing with Art Nouveau. And again, Art Nouveau can be mass manufactured or it can be arts and crafts manufactured. So you can actually be looking at two different ideas. One tip off is if you see things like screws and nails, you're probably not dealing with arts and crafts. In terms of storage, we see some very ornate pieces, almost bringing back Rococo ideas of the use of the curve or the bomb shape that we'll see in some cases, although it takes on a much more linear form. So here we have these linear details running up the side, for example, or throughout the piece, and that use of the whiplash line coming back in on itself. The use of green is going to be very, very common, especially in glass, although it can definitely be clear. And these will often have a lighter finish. We see pieces like this as well that are highly asymmetrical. In the Art Nouveau, you don't need to be entirely symmetrical. And here we see these cut drawers. Now, most of these pieces are going to be in Europe. Some will make their way over to the US, but really we're going to see pieces like this in the US far more often. Very rectilinear in form, but the Art Nouveau element kind of comes out. This would arguably be a mix of sort of federal period, turn of the century, eclectic design. So we've got the poles, the fixtures, which are in a oak leaf and acorn motif. We have these half spindle decorations running down the corners. And then we have a very curvilinear bracket on it or apron on it, leading down to a simple flat foot. And then the back of the dresser again with that curvilinear design. So it's mixing a lot of different ideas. So Art Nouveau is never perfectly pure in the United States, or at least most frequently it won't be perfectly pure in the United States. In terms of tables, we will see, for example, the Asian influence with that elephant trunk leg coming over from China and Japan, as well as the upturned ends on the table in this case. So this is definitely Japanese and Chinese inspired. Here we see something that's a little more European, but we have that sense of romanticism to it. These carved figures on the legs coming down into what looks like a Spanish foot or a paintbrush, but is more stylized than that. We have a sense of asymmetry when we look at from almost any angle. Again, these are going to be primarily European examples, often French, Belgian, sometimes English, not that often, and occasionally German. Now, of course, the Japanese and Chinese influence is going to be quite strong, so you're going to see these mixed elements. Here, you could look at and potentially think that this is Japanese or Chinese on first appearance. But of course, as you look more closely at it, we see elements that would rule that out, that would make it a more Western piece. For example, the fact that this is a big display case, which is not usually part of Japanese interior design. So we see the use of those applied elements. We see the use of what they think of as Japanese carving, so the use of a dragon, for example. But this is, of course, something coming out of the Art Nouveau movement. So dragons and phoenixes are going to be common at this period. They weren't obviously earlier under Japanese influence, but they become far more common in the Art Nouveau. And this is your typical turn of the century sort of curiosity cabinet. Let's show off the interesting things that I've found in my travels around the world, because of course, remember, travel is becoming far more common between the steamliners on the oceans, the railroads, etc. Now, these two examples I'm showing you because I want to show you that things are not always quite as they seem. The dark piece on the left, this is actually labeled by a major antique auction house as Art Nouveau. But you can definitely argue that this is more arts and crafts. Now, it depends on the manufacturing. We could find that there are mass manufactured elements that don't fit what we would think of as arts and crafts. But I would argue the form, being more rectilinear, is going to be more arts and crafts. We have a heart element, which is typical of arts and crafts, far more than Art Nouveau. So this is probably more arts and crafts, but it does dirty the water. Remember some of the examples we saw from, for example, the Red House, where it almost had, some of the furniture had a nearly Gothic feel to it. And this desk definitely has that. Whereas this table, this is a much more modern piece, is in a definitely arts and crafts form. So here we see mortise and tenon. The piece comes all the way through, so the sidebar comes all the way through, and then there's a wedge in the middle to hold the front of the drawer in place. You can see the construction techniques. It's very arts and crafts construction, but in this case, this is an Art Nouveau piece in an arts and crafts form. So, or arts and crafts manufacturing. So that's an example of mixing the two ideas, using the Art Nouveau aesthetic and the arts and crafts focus on craftsmanship.